The next lecture is over Antigone and a little bit about ancient Greece. So I'll start with just some background on ancient Greece that we can also use to apply to the text from Plato, and then I will talk a little further about the story of Antigone. So we have evidence of human settlements and agriculture appearing in Europe later than in the Near East. So when we talked at the beginning of the semester about Mesopotamia and the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, so that's going back to about 10,000 BCE, and settlements in Europe appear a lot later than that. When we're talking about the ancient Greeks, we're talking first about the people who start to settle around the Aegean Sea, and our time frames roughly in 2300s to the 2000s before the Common Era. So just a little map here with a couple of things circled. So you've got, you can see the Aegean Sea at the top there, and then you can, over to the left, we'll talk a little bit about the Mycenaeans. The island of Crete is down a little further. So the Crete is important because of the Minoans, and these are the first people that we typically think of as ancient Greeks. They are very ancient Greeks. So the time frame for the Minoans is from about 2000 to 1400 before the Common Era. The craziest thing about the Minoans to me is that we haven't deciphered their language yet. It's called Linear A, and we don't know how to read it. It blows my mind that in the year 2014 there are still, so many languages out there that we still can't read. The Minoans they developed into a really neat culture with really fancy palaces. They had indoor plumbing. They created these really beautiful frescoes that we have little pieces of today. We know that they traded. We know that they were a peaceful civilization. But they were taken over by the Mycenaeans, and so the Mycenaeans lived on the mainland of Greece. The time frame for them we have roughly is 1800 to 1100. We know that they were a seafaring people who engaged in a lot of oversea trade. Now, where the Minoans were a peaceful society, the Mycenaeans were a warrior culture, and so they were able to extend their influence by conquest, and that's how they overtook the Minoans, by conquesting the island of Crete. They actually absorb a lot of Minoan culture. We have deciphered the Mycenaean language mostly. That one's Linear B, and we trace back the language of ancient Greece. It traces back roughly to Linear B, so we call it the earliest form of ancient Greek. The Mycenaeans actually organized their territories into city-states, which is really cool. And even if you've never heard of Mycenae, you have probably heard of the Trojan War, which is one of the most famous stories in Greek literature. That's actually allegedly where the Trojan War took place, if it actually did take place. And if we ascribed an actual historical date to it, it would have taken place around 1200 BCE. Homer doesn't write it down until a lot later than that, but and then there's some good evidence to believe that the Trojan War actually happened. This is Linear B, so this is the language of the Mycenaeans. So after, from about 1100 BCE until about 300 years later, the civilization of the Mycenaeans begins to decline, and we can see this because the artifacts we have, we know that some palaces were destroyed. Their art actually becomes less complex naturally, as civilization grows and advances, the art is going to become more complex. Actually, during what we call the Dark Ages, their art gets more simple. And they actually stop writing. They stopped using linear B around 1050 BCE. It's really weird. You don't see very often cultures going back to pre-literate societies, but this happens to the Mycenaeans. We're not really sure what to attribute this to. We used to think that it was these Dorians who kept invading from the north. There's an Egyptian source that tells us about these sea people who conquered a lot of the area of where the Mycenaeans lived. We're not quite sure. There were communities being established during this time back in Crete, right, where the Minoans lived, the island of Lesbos, Ionia, but the population declined, trade declined, and the whole system of city-states that the Mycenaeans had established totally collapsed. So you have these really independent and isolated communities. So that's so we head from the Dark Ages to the Archaic Age, and this is where the population begins to rise and people build trade networks again. They discover some new iron implements to advance agriculture, and this is where the Cultural Renaissance kind of happens. There's this great period of economic prosperity. In the Archaic Age, we have writers. So people become literate again, and literacy becomes super important. And this is where we get some of the most famous Greek writers like Homer and Hesiod and Sappho. The city-states of Athens and Sparta rise to prominence. Overseas trade starts happening again. We get the introduction of coin money. So, just a little bit about Homer. He's the author of the Iliad and Odyssey, which are the stories, respectively, of the Trojan War, told from the perspective of the Greeks, right? The Aeneid is the story of the same war told from the perspective of the Trojans who will become the Romans. And then the Odyssey is about the hero Odysseus' journey back home after the war. Hesiod was more of an historian, but he also worked through like religious myths and compiled things into stories about the gods. So just a little bit about the gods, because it's important for us to understand in Antigone. Remember that the Greeks are polytheists. So everyone we've talked about up until now have been monotheists, right? The Hebrews, the Christians, and the Muslims. Now the Greeks believe in many gods instead of just one, and they think that their gods live on Mount Olympus. You've got Zeus, who's the father of all the gods. The thing about the Greek gods that's really interesting is that they are imperfect, right? They're not, they're immortal and they're held above a higher level than humans, but they are given human attributes like jealousy and rage. Gods can, exhibit like preference for people and favoritism and stuff like that. Just a quick little timeline of events for classical Greece that, I think are just kind of important to be able to situate your knowledge of like when things are happening, the Peloponnesian Wars and stuff like that, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. One of our keywords for this unit is going to be hubris, and hubris figures into Antigone really prominently. What hubris means is just having too much pride, right? Being too arrogant, especially towards the gods. And so the story of Prometheus is like the best example to illustrate the dangers of hubris that's unchecked. So remember that Prometheus is he's a titan who cared about humans, and so he stole fire from the heavens and gave it to mankind. But Zeus, remember, who's king of the gods, is pissed off about this. He doesn't think that Prometheus should have given fire to the humans because they weren't ready for it. So he punished Prometheus. He chained him to a rock on the side of a mountain, and every day an eagle showed up and pecked out his liver. And every night his liver regenerated. So his punishment for all of eternity is to be stuck on the side of this cliff, having his liver eaten out every day. So, and this is a story about hubris because Prometheus thought that he could be above the gods, and Zeus was like, not a chance. Just some people of the classical period who we'll talk about. So Sophocles, obviously, is the author of Antigone. Socrates is born in 469 BCE, and he's sentenced to death in 399. Plato founds the Academy in 387. So I'm going to stop that one right here, and then we'll talk a little more about some of the specifics about ancient Greece, and then we'll get into Antigone.